Welcome to our How to Butcher a Pig for Home Use by the University of Minnesota Extension Swine Team. My name is Sarah Schieck Boelke, and I'm a Swine Extension Educator. The purpose of our discussion today is to educate you on how to butcher a pig for home use while focusing on human safety, pig safety, and food safety. I've got several of my coworkers joining in this conversation, and I'd like to introduce them at this time. Ryan Cox is our Extension Meat Specialist.
Hello.
We've got Dornink, who is our Meat Laboratory Supervisor.
Hello.
And Lee Johnston, a Swine Extension Specialist.
How you doing?
And I also want to give a shout out to Minnesota Pork, as they also were integral parts in providing content, helping with that, and also our animal sponsor. Before we get too far into the video, I also want to point out and set the stage for our discussion today. We're recording this video on May 22nd, 2020. And because of our current situation with COVID-19, many of our packing plants are experiencing labor shortage. With that, it's causing several pork packing plants to close, which is causing buildup on farm of pigs that would typically go through those market channels at that time. Because of that, a lot of our producers are looking for alternative markets that are needed for those pigs. And with that, they are selling pigs to consumers. However, a lot of our local and small-scale Minnesota meat processors are scheduled out for months. So with that, a lot of those consumers that are purchasing pigs from the farm, they are looking to self-butcher those pigs. So that's what we're gonna walk through today in this video. Another thing I'd like to point out before we get too far is if you are purchasing a pig from a farmer, the pig must leave the farm alive and cannot be processed on the farm. That is according to federal and state laws. When purchasing a live pig from the farmer, it is best to bring that animal to a licensed slaughter facility, or worst case scenario, process it yourself. At the end of this video, there is a link where you can visit the Minnesota Department of Ag website to find contact information for local small processors within Minnesota. Another thing to add is this pork that you're getting from the pig, because it's probably processed by you, it's only for personal consumption. So meaning you and your immediate family, it cannot be sold or donated to anyone else outside of your family. Does anybody else have anything that they would like to add to those points that maybe I forgot about?
Well, Sarah, whenever we think about preparing to harvest pigs at home, it's obviously a very graphic situation. And if there's children, small children around, there needs to be some discussion and thought about that in the family ahead of time, whether you want the children there. And some families think that's part of life, and they need to witness that and judge the age, but prepare those children and be thinking about that, and maybe the neighbors and others that may have sensibilities to that process. The other thing is, this is a serious business. So when you have your buddies there and so forth, be thinking about safety, be thinking about it's not necessarily a party, so some of the adult beverages and that maybe should be set aside until the work's done, and do that afterwards. Of course, you mentioned human safety is of utmost importance, but it's safety for the humans, the butchers, and also the onlookers. We also need to think about safety for the pig. Yes, the pig is going to be sacrificed, harvested at the end of this, during this process, but up until the point that he is dead, we need to make sure that we got good pig welfare and pig handling. And then, of course, food safety. You're going to be consuming it in your family, and those things are going to be hit on pretty heavily by Dallas and Ryan. So A few of those things we need to think about before we get started.
Thanks for those comments.
So some things that we want to think about as we're preparing to stun the pig and then eventually and bleed that animal out. We need to think now about food safety. As we're thinking about the safety of the animal, we need to think forward and think about food safety. So we look to guidance from people that do it every day. And using FDA's 8 key sanitation conditions is a great way to start. I've highlighted the major points so that we can apply this to the home or the barn or the garage, what have you. So number one, we want to start with clean water. We're using water to do cleaning, but if the water itself isn't clean, then we're simply recontaminating. We need to think about the cleanliness of every food contact surface, meaning every surface that will come in contact with what will be food, which is the pig. We consider cross-contamination, so essentially the cleaning of everything else that might not necessarily be considered a food contact surface, but is also very important. Thinking about our outer garments, thinking about the utensils we use, etc. Proper hand washing, this is the number one, in many people's opinions, the number one cause of cross-contamination is improper hand washing or improper personal hygiene. Additionally, we think about adulteration from other materials, okay, lubricants, fuel, pesticides, etc. Where you're doing this work is where you typically don't process a pig if you're taking this on new. So we want to remember all the other things that we don't want in our food, as well as how we're going to be storing the product. And that's a really big sticking point right now for when we're taking a very large pig that can be in excess of 300 pounds, cutting it down to a carcass that's well over 200 pounds, and needing to get it cold fast. So we have to have that accommodation set in advance and knowing where we're going to go with that product. The general health condition of the people around us obviously is going to affect food safety and is certainly paramount right now in 2020, thinking about the COVID-19 response. And then ultimately pests. If we're doing this outdoors, all of those things carry bacteria as well, whether that be cockroaches, ants, or birds, worms, etc. All carry bacteria with them, which are dangerous for us to eat. So lining up some of the equipment that you're likely going to need for this process. First would be a firearm. We're recommending a lower caliber firearm, 22 rifles very nicely. The problems with larger calibered firearms is that they will go completely through the animal and start to hit surfaces. And Lee did make reference to this. It's a discussion that we have, and one of the points that we're concerned with of people that do this a little bit more often is trying to get this animal stunned properly with a firearm in a safe environment. So concrete is something we're going to try to avoid because we do see ricochet from concrete, etc. We also want good footing for the animal, so lots of consideration there. You've got 2 types of knives that you'll use if you can use them. A siding knife is just the broader styled knife, and then a boning knife is a more narrow knife with a little more flex to it that lets us get between bones and tendons. A hand saw, or if you want to use a power saw, we're looking for a hand, essentially reciprocating saw, or a electric reciprocating saw like a Sawzall, etc. You'll see us use a reciprocating saw in the process, specialized for meats, but certainly in this scenario we can find a saw as well. A honing steel, important to keep the blade of your knife straight. It's not really sharpening your blade, but it's keeping it straight. But also a sharpening stone, making sure that you're keeping a sharp knife. A very sharp knife is an important part of this process. Using the phrase gambrel, essentially what we're saying is we need a pipe, a stick, or something to, if you're looking to pick the pig up from its hind legs, you'll want those spread apart to make the processing easier. You don't necessarily have to hang the carcass from both feet. You can hang from one foot, but it's certainly nice to have. A chain or a rope, if you're going to be suspending the carcass in any way, important. We'll talk about how you can process both ways, where the carcass is hanging and also on a table. And so with that, recommend a folding table, even if you are doing some work with a hanging carcass. If you use a cleanable folding table or plywood with a clean tarp on top of it, then you've got a nice surface for processing pork. And finally, a hose, a water source so you can continue to rinse away all the effluent and things that you don't want on your food. Okay.
So next, probably a logical point in our process here would be working with the live animal. Lee, I know you mentioned not only human safety, but also thinking about the pig safety and welfare. Do you want to talk a little bit about handling that pig, how to do it properly?
Sure, Sarah. The pig is needs to be handled calmly. We don't want to get the pig excited or stressed. It can have adverse effects on meat quality. It can have adverse effects on the process. A pig that is excited and agitated will be much more difficult to handle. And particularly thinking about people that may not have a lot of experience handling pigs. And so I just wanted to share a couple tips here. Sorting panels. And so when we handle pigs in the commercial setting, we use sorting panels, which is the reddish or orangish board here that the young lady is using to move the pig. The pig sees that as an obstacle or a wall. And if they can't see through it, they usually don't try to go through there or go there. So you can use that moving sorting panel to guide a pig in one direction or another. Those panels, if you bought purpose-built panels, they're 40 or 50 bucks a piece, but you can easily make one out of a 1/2-inch sheet of plywood, cut some handholds in it, or some similar thing that's solid to guide the pig in the direction you want. Of course, if we're using firearms to stun the pig, we've got to make sure that we get the people out of the way and those kind of things. The other thing to think about when we handle this pig is the pig has a flight zone. And so you can think of the flight zone as kind of the personal bubble around the pig. And as you step into that outer edge of the flight zone, the pig is going to move away from you. And so we want to make sure that we can move the pig in the direction we want, get him in the area, but do it very calmly and work on the edge of the flight zone and try to stay out of the pig's blind spot, because if he can't see you, he's going to be more startled, and so it's best to stay out of that blind spot. So a few other things to think about is as we move that pig into a space where he's going to be stunned, we want to have a sturdy pin or some kind of enclosure around that pig, and think a lot about the flooring. If we're using some kind of a firearm, concrete floor, think about projectiles, the bullet maybe going through the pig and then reflecting off the floor. So maybe dirt or grass base might be a good place to stun that pig, or maybe on a bed of wood chips or something like that. Of course, if you go to dirt, then that's going to create some challenge keeping that pig clean and the carcass clean. And Dallas and Ryan might have some comments about that. But the other thing we want to think about too is prior to harvest, keep the pig off feed for at least 12 hours so that helps him empty his intestine, his gastrointestinal tract out. It'll make the gutting process and so forth easier. And by doing that, the pig will become hungry, and you might be able to use feed to coax the pig into the particular position you want him in for the stun. Of course, we've got to make sure that the pig has water that whole 12 hours. We don't want to hold him off water, but make sure that we get him off feed, and makes the process a whole lot easier on the pig and on the people that are processing the pig. So that's just a few tips. We don't want to make you livestock handlers out of this whole process, but realize that there are some key points in handling pigs. The key point is keep them calm. A mad pig, an upset pig, usually does not end well. So keep them calm.
Moving to the stun. Without getting too graphic and showing this process, we in our video will pick up after the stun. But understanding where the brain of the animal is very important. And so you can see here, typically when we're going in with electric, it's going to be behind the ears, but with what we're using a captive bolt, or in home use, we're looking for a firearm. You're looking for a point that is approximately 20 millimeters above the eyes, the line of the eyes, almost parallel or even with the backbone. And you can see the shape of the brain there, and that's what you're trying to hit. And so when that fire is made, you want that done once, and you are to expect the animal to drop and start what we call kicking out. It's very important to understand that this is an involuntary muscle response, very much like a seizure in human beings. The animal is unconscious and is deemed senseless to pain, and so we need to let that process continue. Normally in meat processing, we might move forward with processing. For home processing, we are recommending that you let that animal completely kick out. Do not approach a moving animal for your own safety, for the safety of everyone around you. Do not approach an animal unless it has completely stopped moving and you can start to confirm death. So some signs of sensibility, some things that show us that the animal can still sense its environment or things around it, and what we use as indicators of death. The corneal reflex, thinking about the smaller muscles around the eye, those are going to be reflexes that are lost later in the process of death. You can see rhythmic breathing, and as rhythmic breathing ceases or becomes irregular, that's signs of death nearing. Eye tracking, essentially the stillness of the eyes, no longer tracking moving objects. No more natural blinking at all. If you were to simply touch near the eye on the face, you would not see the animal blink. And there is simply no riding reflex at all. There's no more kick out, etc. From that point, we can confirm, as the animal is no longer breathing, that it is dead and we can proceed.
Oh, yeah, Ryan, just to clarify, riding reflex, that's where the pig is trying to get on his feet or sit up or something like that. When that's gone, then the pig is insensible, right?
Yes, and so we broadly use riding reflex as a phrase where the animal is expressing its fight or flight mechanisms. The kick out of the legs is part of that riding response. And so when all of that movement has stopped, the animal is completely still and breathing has stopped, is when we want to then we can make our approach. Okay, so we're starting in the stick process or the exsanguination where we're removing the blood. Remember, in this process, we're not approaching an animal that is moving. We've got a completely dead animal, and now we're going about the business of removing the blood. When that happens, the animal will be on the ground. We're demonstrating that process as the animal's hanging so that visibility is increased and you can see the angles that we're using. But here we're starting the video showing where that stick was made. We've already in this video stuck the pig and it has bled. It is completely dead so that we can use it for our purposes of our video. But here we're going to show you the angle in which you're trying to go in and sever the arteries coming out, or the main vessels coming out of the top of the heart. So some things to think about here: you want to have a very sharp knife, preferably something that is a two-sided knife to get a very efficient stick. You're going at an upward angle and you're going under what would be the clavicles. Dallas, any thoughts?
Make sure your knife is slightly pointed up. If you go straight in, you're going to hit the backbone and you're not going to be able to cut anything.
Very good. Moving forward. Here you can see we're lowering the pig onto a cradle with our inspector making an assist there. You will not likely have a cradle if you're looking to process. You can use a table. If you're using a table, if you put the table up and then you lay blocks or bricks in 2 rows and then put your tarp over it, you can essentially lay the pig down between that row of those 2 rows of blocks or bricks to hold it so your midline is pointed straight up so that you can further process. Something else that we also want to make sure that we remember is the first cuts that we make are going to open up the midline or the belly of this animal, so we want that to be clean. From this point forward, the animal is dead and it is now a carcass, so we consider everything essentially in our way from food. Things that we're going to remove away to leave what is left, the carcass, which is an edible product. So getting this midline very clean is important so that we don't push external environment in, push external contamination inward towards the food. And we accomplish that mostly with hosing.
Before cutting, you may want to have a pot of hot water, at least 150 degrees, that you can be dipping your knife in once it gets contaminated to sterilize it before you begin cutting again.
One question that I have, Ryan, is when you're spraying the carcass off before you even make that cut, is there any recommendation for the temperature of water, or does it not matter at this point, just so that you can get any organic matter off of that pig?
Generally, we like to use warm or hot water when we're towards the end of our process as an intervention or a discouragement from bacteria. We know that in the home or on the farm, you're less likely to have very hot water from a hose at any pressure. So using that is great for getting some of the larger pieces off. But if cold water works just fine, And you're really trying to get the biggest, most visible contamination away. We know for a fact there's contamination there that we won't get and we can't see, but cold water can definitely do the trick. Looking at where we start making the cuts for the hide, you'll note here that we're starting at the foot. Dallas is starting here at the foot. We're working our way from the ground up, and so we're trying to remove the dirtiest portions of the animal or the carcass first. And so you'll notice his blade is pointing out and up. Again, creating a clean line. As you expose the surface under the skin, you'll notice bright white. That is the connective tissue that we're looking to separate throughout the entire siding or the entire skinning process. Here you see the other foot being removed. As you begin this cut, you're making this cut at the joint. Remember that at each joint there is a portion of cartilage that joins bone, and that's the portion that we're trying to separate.
And if you can apply pressure to the inside of the foot while you're cutting it, it will expose the joint, so it'll be easier to cut through.
A great way to expose a joint is to move it much like it would naturally, and you can see the part that's moving and the part that's not moving. That's essentially where your joint is.
The joint will typically be about 3 fingers from the hock, and that would be where you would cut in with your knife, applying pressure while you are cutting through the joint.
Remember, pressure, tension, and gravity are always your friend when you're cutting meat, as you're doing less work with your knife and letting the process essentially break at these joints.
And this is what a boning knife would look like, is what I'm using in the video.
Moving to the midline, he's moving around the stick wound, and so that point there is where the animal was bled. That wound will actually need to be cut out and removed, as it is, again, another example of the external environment being introduced into the internal environment, and so we have opportunity for contamination. Moving to just to the side of the midline, so as to avoid any major encounters with the pizzle, the seed line, etc. Also very important.
And be careful not to cut too deep while you're making this line, or you will break through into the belly. So while skinning, if you can keep the skin tight with your non-knife hand and skin with the other, trying to do as smooth strokes as possible, being extra careful on the belly, because that's where the bacon comes from.
Always try to use your left or your non-dominant hand to hold the hide, and preferably as you continue on, hold the outside of the hide, so that's the dirty side. So we have less opportunity to introduce that left hand to the inside, which is essentially we're exposing food now.
Take your time and make sure your knife is sharp.
Yes. Rehoning your knife, resanitizing your knife is also very important. You'll notice here as they're using a siding knife now, the broader knife, choking up on the knife, giving you more control. Again, safety being number one.
So you grab the pizzle with your non-knife hand and you cut just underneath it, and it'll be a small white looking tube, and will just follow that up to the rectum, up in between the hind legs. As you can see, the white, it looks just like a white tube.
So moving to the hind legs, this is the gambrel, or what would be the Achilles tendon in a human. This is where we look to hang the carcass from. It is a very strong joint, which is why it's very important to make sure that hind leg is removed properly.
And if you feel with your hands, you will feel the bone and the tendon and poke in between them with your knife to make a hole without cutting the tendon. And once you get the gambrel in, you are ready to hoist and finish skinning the pig, starting with removing the tail.
As we're exposing the tail here, you'll see it show up. You'll also see the rectum and the body cavity. Notice that we're continuing to rinse and sanitize the knife as we're working our way towards the digestive system, which can give us plenty of contamination.
And try to slice through the rectum with one clean slice.
Here you can see the break of the tailbone at cartilage. Again, we're always taking advantage of those cartilaginous junctures between bone to give us a separation.
And once you get the hide loosened and you can easily pull down on it, you can make a couple handles in the skin, and then you can pull the hide down almost all the way down to the head.
The advantage of pulling hides is that it gives you a smoother surface, a cleaner surface, and there is far less interaction of the human with the product, so there's less opportunity for contamination. Please note you can do this by pulling straight down. We don't need to employ a four-wheeler or a pickup truck to get this done.
You will then remove the skin until you are level with the bottom of the feet or legs. And that is where the joint will typically be to remove the head. Head removal is easier done with a boning knife than a skinning knife.
See, even with that front leg. As you move inward through the muscle, trying to expose essentially a joint, which is what we refer to as the atlas and axis bones or joints. This is where the head swivels. It looks somewhat like a saddle. You can see it being pointed at there with the blade. That is the point of separation. And so another handle has been cut in the hide. Moving from that siding knife to the boning knife, you'll notice is a more narrow blade, more flexible. It can get between those joints. We can see the atlas and axis being separated here.
So you start in the middle of the hind legs and work down. And your knife will find a natural nook in the bone, and you will slide your knife down that until you have popped the H bones apart.
We refer to the hip bones as H bones as common meat slang.
And you notice I start in a downward motion, and then when I am going to pop them apart, I will adjust my hand so I am pushing forward and not cutting down. Cutting down, you are more likely to hit the rectum.
Which we don't want because that will cause contamination, correct?
Correct.
We like to think of this somewhat like a balloon, if you will, or a bag of manure inside of a carcass of meat. And so we're taking every precaution that we can to make sure that nothing escapes that bag. And so each end of that is isolated. Here you can see that's done with the rectum as he's isolating that, cutting around that and pulling it forward to the front side.
So here I'm gonna choke up on the knife so my fingers are past the handle. That way I am only cutting down the belly, the midline, and I am not piercing or slicing into any guts or intestines that I do not want to, which is also another food safety risk. And you will slide your knife down until you come to the breastplate. Then you will go back up and grab the anus and just follow that down. You can use your kidneys as a guideline. And you'll just follow that down and be pulling away your guts, your intestines, so you're not accidentally cutting into them.
Please note that most of these organs are hanging on the back or the top body wall, if you will. And so that is the tendon that you need to separate from.
And then you will slice through the top of the liver there, which will release it, being careful not to hit the bile sac.
So Ryan, we need to maybe think a little bit about when we pull these guts out and so forth, looking for milk spots on the livers, white spots that might show worm infestations previously when the pig was alive. Also look for abscesses or other kinds of things inside the carcass that might create a food safety concern. You want to comment anything on that?
Certainly. So a large signal or sign of disease or illness is going to be in the liver. You'll see some scarring. So if it's not a smooth sort of brownish reddish organ with little marking, then that's fine. But if you start to see marks and scarring, that can be a sign of disease. Additionally, you can see that scarring in the lungs, also a sign of disease. You may have noticed the animal actually physically coughing. All signs of disease, things that we can be concerned about and perhaps look further into and consult further on the safety of the product.
If an abscess is encountered, clean your knife before removing it and cut all around it without poking into it before continuing, and then sterilize your knife once again.
Yep, that's a good point.
Yep.
Any abscess or fecal or dirt that gets on the carcass should be removed before rinsing off.
So when you say remove it, Dallas, you mean cut underneath it and lift it off rather than wash it off?
Correct.
Yep.
So how much like hide and offal and any other waste should a person expect that they would have and need to dispose of?
So a good rule of thumb is generally, without getting specific to each part, you're going to look at a market weight animals between 270, 280 to 300, 310 pounds. Of that, you're going to get, as a hot carcass, you're going to get about 220 pounds to 240 pounds of that. And so, as you can see, that difference is going to be the drop, what we would call the drop weight, 60 pounds maybe, 70 pounds possibly. That would include the hide, the head, the internal organs, etc.
And it's important that folks dispose of those things properly. Caution should be given. They should not be fed raw to pets. Also should not be disposed just in dumpsters or along the roadside or within wooded areas. It is important to follow Minnesota Board of Animal Health guidelines for disposing of carcasses properly, which that information can be found on their website, which is linked at the end of this presentation. And we've also got it down in the description as well.
So Ryan, that 60 to 70 pounds of drop, to get some concept of the amount there, that would fit in an average size wheelbarrow that someone would have at their garage or something, right?
Yeah, that's about the majority of a wheelbarrow load, and that's a very good use or a very good application would be the wheelbarrow, given its height as well, seeing as you could slide that essentially right up under if you had the carcass hanging even by 1 foot. Last item to come out as part of the viscera, which is behind the diaphragm. Kidneys lay in a bed of fat as well, and so you have to get them out of that bed of fat to expose essentially what you have here is the diaphragm. Everything in front of the diaphragm we refer to as the pluck. And so that would be the heart, the lungs, the trachea, and the esophagus.
So you're going to take your knife and follow just to the left or right of the breastplate so you can cut through the cartilage of the rib. And when you get to the bottom, you will come back in and break the bottom two ribs apart. That way you can easily remove the heart and lungs.
To get to the heart and lungs, you do need to cut around and separate, or essentially remove, the diaphragm so that you can you can see the bright pink lungs there. And then the heart. Apologies, visibility does get a little tricky here in this tight spot, but you can see, again, all of those organs we're removing from the back wall, if you will. There's no real connection up towards that sternum or breastplate that we're referring to. All the connection is along the backbone.
Once you've broke through the diaphragm, you can follow the rib down on either side to loosen up the sac that holds the heart and is keeping it in place. And then you can follow down the spinal column to loosen it all up till you are able to pull the pluck out.
You can see trachea, back to the heart, and then the lung, the heart, and then the lungs. Left with an empty body cavity. So here we're looking, if you do choose to start fabricating on the rail, Dallas is outlining where you would be pulling the loin muscle, what is commonly referred to in deer processing as the backstrap. But that would be the loin muscle he just has outlined. Here we're outlining the sirloin portion, okay, another common portion that's removed, and then a knife cut can be made and a saw cut can be made to remove that entire hind saddle or those hind legs. We are recommending that you use a sanitized table, and so that's what we'll use here. Commonly, we would process further with automation, et cetera, but we're looking to make it look like you would have at home. So a clean, sanitized folding table will work great. Again, we can use plywood with a tarp on it, a clean tarp that has been cleaned and sanitized as well. And again, you can employ, as I'd mentioned, the bricks or whatnot to hold the midline straight up if that's how you prefer to work. You'll find now that we're fabricating a carcass and trying to get it into the cooler that we don't necessarily need it to be midline up the entire time.
So Ryan, talk a little bit about that sanitizer. What kind of product would one use for that? I can imagine there's some disinfectants and sanitizers that would not be desirable for a food contact.
Right, and so it's important, regardless of the brand, the label, et cetera, that it shows that it is approved for food contact surfaces, and that is a specific type of sanitizer that once it's applied does not need to be rinsed off. As a function of how it works, it destroys itself as well as any bacteria or contamination. So regardless, we want to wash first to remove any of the large soils, and then we sanitize with an approved substance. Again, lots of different products out there, but they do need to say approved for food contact surfaces. The cut is being made for the fresh ham, where we're separating the hip bone. You'll notice on the angle of the H bone that you have already split.
A good reference point is a finger width away from the H bone to make your cut to remove your fresh ham.
Something to keep in mind now as we're continuing to fabricate, very likely outdoors or in a garage, is that regardless of this process, we are hopefully getting to cold as fast as possible. So separation is made. You'll see the H-bone here with the arrow is where we've made that separation before in the midline of the carcass. And then this cut is made basically parallel to that into the other portion of the hip bone, and so that it can be separated at that angle. finishing all cuts with your knife to avoid your saw cutting the table. Here we go between the second and third ribs when we remove the shoulder from a pork carcass. You can do that by placing your knife on the inside of the carcass, locating that juncture, and giving yourself some guidelines. You can use the handsaw or the electric saw to cut through the sternum where those ribs were joining at the front or the top in this example, and then cutting down through the backbone and ultimately through the two scapulas or the blade bones. Something to remember, since you will be processing a hot carcass, hot carcasses move a lot more than cold carcasses do, and so it's important to be mindful of safety and mindful of where you're cutting. This optional step is where you're splitting the two shoulders, and this cut is made right down the backbone. You can do this by handsaw, and we're demonstrating by handsaw. We will here in a minute be also demonstrating by electric saw. You can see this will take a lot of cutting to separate the shoulders. Alternatively, you can go on that front leg. You can cut under the scapula. The scapula is actually not connected to the backbone, so you can remove both front legs from the shoulder with a knife, or you can make this separation so you have the entire shoulder portion with the front leg attached.
When making this cut, try to stay in the middle of your spinal column.
Moving to the sirloin portion, you're cutting just behind where the belly comes together, or the belly comes to the midline of the animal. So finishing the cut with your knife, you're separating and removing the sirloin, both sides of the sirloin portion. You will expose the top loin and the tenderloin muscle. So you can see that in this face here, as well as in this face here.
Next, we will remove the tenderloin. And you're simply using the backbone as your guide and sliding your knife between the tenderloin and the backbone as you pull the tenderloin away.
Again, remembering tension and gravity is your friend in knife cutting. Much of the work is being done with his left hand here.
And once you expose the seam, you can almost pull it right out.
And this tenderloin, the small portion of the head is not connected as it was part of the sirloin.
Just a reminder here, after the skinning got done, then you changed gloves and washed up before started working on cutting up the carcass, correct?
Correct.
Very important the entire time, anytime you encounter possible contamination, is to rewash both yourself and your equipment. The second tenderloin portion. Here with the handsaw, cut is being made along the ribs so as to remove basically the loin and the belly from the backbone. This isn't commonly done in meat processing in a cold environment in regular production. However, certainly at home and on farm, we're recommending doing it this way as it is faster, more efficient, and gets it into the cooler quicker.
So I've got a question about bacon here. What if someone wanted bacon? Is there a certain cut that needs to be made?
Yeah, so here we're essentially leaving the spare ribs and the belly, which goes to bacon, together to get them into the cooler and chilled down as fast as we can for safety reasons. In further processing, we would remove those spare ribs, and then you have a fresh belly that is ready for curing and smoking.
Okay. And with home processing like this, is there a way that a person could get their bacon if they wanted to? And if so, what's something they might have to do?
So with bacon, you're looking at additional ingredients, smoking, etc. Something that can be done in the home. We can provide guidance for that. Also can work with a processor to get your products smoked as well.
Here I'm using the reciprocating saw to cut through the ribs instead of a hand saw. Make sure that's clean before and sanitized before you make any cuts. And you simply just have to make sure you're through each rib. And the rest can be done with a knife.
Please be mindful of the fact that we are now using electricity, electrical power tools in a very wet environment. And so again, safety is paramount. Understanding where your cording is, understanding your surroundings and where all of the other people might be around you is very, very important. When you get past the ribs towards the back of the carcass, there will be no more, so essentially you're separating the loin muscle, the top loin muscle, from the backbone and the processes that stretch out in the direction of ribs but don't quite go as far as ribs would.
So once you're through all the ribs, the rest can be done with your knife and the saw can be put away. And I'm simply just using the back bone as my guide, and I'm sliding my knife down the back ribs to remove the loin.
So here we have the entire portions of the carcass, or the wholesale primals of the carcass set out. Again, we would have normally been putting them into this bag as we went. And so you can see we're using a can liner here, clean bags going into a cooler on top of ice, not overpacking the cooler. So we're really only putting 2 to 3 large primals from that pig into this cooler on top of ice so that it can get chilling down quickly. And then ice goes on top of it in abundance. So there's just a small portion, but we're coming back with a good bit more. This amount of ice is to ensure that we can get this meat and this carcass essentially down below 45 degrees as quickly as possible. So with all of these wholesale primals here, the large primals, hopefully they're going into to chill as fast as possible. Using a clean bag free of holes, onto ice, not overcrowding your cooler so that you get proper chilling, 2 to 3 primals on ice.
So Ryan, we talked earlier that this is about a 200-pound carcass, and I've seen an estimate that you need about 1 pound of ice per pound of carcass weight. Is that true? And if that's true, then we're talking about 200 pounds of ice to get this carcass totally chilled. So that's a lot of ice.
It's a lot of ice. You'll notice in the video it's not nearly that much, because the next comment I make is that you're likely going to need to do 2 to 3 exchanges of that ice as it melts down and equilibrates with the meat. Also, with that meat inside of a bag, as it's melting down, we don't want to be soaking that product in water. So that bag being free of holes, et cetera, is also very important. But you're going through a fair amount of ice. There's a lot of heat in a carcass that needs to be dissipated for food safety reasons.
And approximately how long do we need to chill that carcass before we might cut it up further into retail cuts and such?
We recommend chilling carcasses at least 24 hours. The reality is that it could likely get down below 45 degrees in less time than that. But the safest way to do that, and quite honestly from a practical perspective, that allows you to clean the space, come back the next day and prepare for further processing in a colder environment possibly if you can. So 24 hours is definitely a good rule of thumb.
And the closer to 40 degrees is the better.
Yes, definitely closer to 40 degrees is better. Something else to remember about colder meat is that it is firmer, it cuts easier. So that's also important. The quality of the meat will be better if we can chill it in a sufficient amount of time. Another note to that is you do not want to take a hot carcass and freeze it. Because if you go directly to freezing, once that product is thawed, you will deal with all sorts of meat quality issues. The carcass will have not gone properly through rigor, and so it will attempt to go through rigor once it's thawed, and so you'll deal with all sorts of issues. So we want this carcass chilled, but not frozen.
Good points. Any other last comments that people have?
I think just summarize that it's unprecedented times and people are doing things differently than they normally would, and just need to make sure we keep human safety, pig safety, and food safety top of mind through the whole process.
And probably one other reminder, again, we said it at the beginning, but if you're processing this pig at home, it's for your own personal use. It's not for resale. It's not for food donation. It needs to be for your family's personal use. So with that, thank you for listening and watching our video on how to butcher a pig for home use. Hopefully now you feel comfortable with your task of butchering a pig that you have now acquired for food use.